Islamabad, Pakistan, April 7, 2026, 11:43 p.m. local time. In a secure communications room inside the Prime Minister's residence, Shehbaz Sharif is on two phones simultaneously. One line connects him to Washington. The other connects him to Tehran. His army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, is seated across the table, monitoring both conversations in real time. 14 hours earlier, Donald Trump had posted on Truth Social that Iran faced the destruction of its bridges, power plants, and its whole civilization. His deadline was hours away. Iranian missiles were ready. American carrier strike groups, 3 of them, were positioned in the Gulf. The world was not watching Pakistan. It should have been, because in that room in Islamabad at 11:43 p.m. on April 7, 2026, a phone call that lasted less than 40 minutes did something no summit, no UN resolution, and no American ultimatum had managed to do in nearly 5 decades. It put the United States and Iran on a path toward direct conversation. Hours later, Trump paused the strikes. He cited, and I quote, "a request from Pakistan." That is the sentence almost no one covered properly. My name is James Landon, and in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to explain to you why Pakistan, a country that was broke, isolated, accused of harboring terrorists, and publicly humiliated by Donald Trump himself just 8 years ago, became the single most important diplomatic actor in the most dangerous geopolitical crisis of 2026. Not because it was powerful, because it understood something that Washington and Tehran had both forgotten. Stay with me. To understand why Pakistan matters, you first need to understand exactly what happened on February 28, 2026, and why the world was not prepared for it. At approximately 2 a.m. Tehran time, United States and Israeli forces launched a coordinated air campaign codenamed Operation Epic Fury. The targets were Iran's nuclear facilities, its military leadership infrastructure, and, in what became the most consequential single moment of the operation, the Supreme Leader's compound. Ali Khamenei, the man who had governed Iran with absolute authority for 34 years, was killed within the first 6 hours of the operation. Let that land for a moment. The spiritual and political leader of 90 million people, the man whose portrait hung in government buildings across Iran, whose religious authority guided policy from Lebanon to Yemen, was dead before most of the world had woken up to check their phones. What followed was predictable in its direction and catastrophic in its scale. Iran launched over 400 ballistic missiles and more than 3,000 drones across the Middle East within 72 hours. UDETA's military bases in Iraq, Qatar, and Bahrain were struck. Israeli cities activated shelter protocols for the first time since 2024. Saudi Arabia's Jubail petrochemical complex, one of the largest industrial facilities in the world, was hit. Oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz reversed course. Within 4 days, global oil prices had risen 34%. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day, was effectively shut. Think about what that means for your life. Not abstractly, concretely. Every gallon of gas that costs more. Every airline ticket that becomes more expensive, every shipping container delayed, every product that gets more costly before it reaches a store shelf. The Strait of Hormuz is not a distant geography. It is a pressure point on the global economy that, when squeezed, squeezes back everywhere. Now, who was going to stop this? The United Nations Security Council attempted to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Russia and China vetoed it. The European Union issued statements. Qatar, which had previously mediated between the United States and Iran, offered its services and was rebuffed by Tehran. Oman, which had historically served as a back channel for U.S.-Iran communications, tried to insert itself and found its messages going unanswered on the Iranian side. The reason for those failures is important, and it is the reason Pakistan succeeded where all of them failed. Iran, in the aftermath of Khamenei's assassination, was not looking for mediation from countries that were, in its view, embedded in the Western order. Qatar hosts a massive U.S. military base. Oman is an ally of Gulf states that had, at least tacitly, supported the U.S. Israeli strikes by not mobilizing in opposition. Europe was, in Iranian eyes, structurally aligned with Washington, regardless of what its diplomats said. Iran needed a country that Washington trusted and that Tehran did not perceive as Washington's instrument. That country, against almost everyone's expectations, was Pakistan. Here is what makes this story extraordinary. In January 2018, Donald Trump, the same man who would eventually praise Pakistan's leadership as great people and true friends, sent his first tweet of the year about Pakistan. It read, "The United States has foolishly given Pakistan more than $33 billion in aid over the last 15 years, and they have given us nothing but lies and deceit." 8 years later, that same Donald Trump called Pakistan's prime minister to ask for help stopping a war. That gap between lies and deceit and trusted mediator is not an accident. It is a story of deliberate, patient, calculated repositioning. And understanding how Pakistan pulled it off tells you something important about how power actually works in a world that is reorganizing faster than most analysts can track. Pakistan's journey to April 2026 begins not in 2026, but in 2025. And it begins not with diplomacy, but with survival. Pakistan entered 2025 in economic crisis. Its foreign exchange reserves had nearly collapsed. The IMF had extended a rescue program worth $7 billion, Pakistan's largest ever, after the country came within weeks of a sovereign debt default. Inflation had been running above 20% for 2 consecutive years. The Pakistani rupee had lost more than half its value against the dollar over a 3-year period. Electricity prices had been raised multiple times under IMF conditionality, triggering protests in Karachi and Lahore. In the conventional analysis, a country in that condition does not become a global mediator. It manages its crises quietly and hopes for external financial support. But Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, had a different read on the situation. Munir understood something structural. Pakistan's greatest asset in a destabilizing world was not its military, its nuclear deterrent, or its economy. It was its geography and its Rolodex. Pakistan shares a 900-kilometer border with Iran. It hosts the largest Muslim population of any nuclear-armed state on Earth. It has maintained formal diplomatic relations with both the United States and Iran without ever formally joining either's strategic axis. And crucially, since the United States and Iran severed diplomatic ties in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis, the Pakistani embassy in Washington had been formally representing Iranian diplomatic interests in the United States. Read that again. For 47 years, before any of this crisis began, Pakistani diplomats were the ones delivering Iran's messages to the American government. The infrastructure for communication had never been dismantled. It had just been dormant. Munir activated it. In late 2025, Pakistani military and intelligence officials began quietly expanding their back-channel contacts with both Washington and Tehran. Pakistan signed a landmark strategic mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia in September 2025, a move that deepened Islamabad's ties with the Gulf and, indirectly, signaled to Washington that Pakistan was positioning itself as a responsible regional stabilizer rather than a rogue actor. Pakistan also joined what Trump called the Board of Peace, a consultative body Trump had created in the aftermath of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire in late 2025. Each of these moves, taken individually, looked like normal diplomatic activity. Taken together, they were the foundation of a position that would become indispensable the moment a real crisis arrived. That crisis arrived on February 28, 2026. When Operation Epic Fury began and Khamenei was killed, Pakistan's reaction was immediate and strategically complex. Protests erupted within hours in Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and Peshawar. Pakistan's Shia Muslim community, which represents roughly 15 to 20% of the population, poured into the streets. In Karachi, crowds breached the outer gate of the U.S. consulate before security forces intervened. At least 20 people were killed in the unrest nationwide. Islamabad condemned the U.S. Israeli strikes, but it did not break relations with Washington. That combination, genuine public condemnation combined with maintained diplomatic contact, was not weakness. It was the asset. Iran's new leadership, navigating the shock of Khamenei's death, needed to know that any country offering to mediate was not simply Washington's mouthpiece. Pakistan's public condemnation provided that proof. Tehran believed that Islamabad was capable of delivering an honest message from the Iranian side to Washington without filtering it through an American lens. Washington, meanwhile, needed a country with direct reach into Tehran. The CIA had no functioning channel. The State Department had no embassy. The Omani back channel, which had operated quietly for years, had gone cold. Pakistan was the only country that could physically put a senior American official in the same room as a senior Iranian official, and guarantee that both sides would show up. That guarantee rested on one specific relationship: the personal trust that had developed between Field Marshal Asim Munir and the Trump administration. Elizabeth Threlkeld, director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center, described it precisely. Pakistan wouldn't be convening these talks if it didn't have that strong relationship with Washington and that personal trust. The mechanics of what followed were extraordinary. In early March, as Iranian and American forces continued to exchange fire and Trump issued escalating deadlines, Pakistani diplomats were shuttling proposals between Washington and Tehran, sometimes physically carrying written documents. On March 27, Trump announced a 10-day pause on threatened strikes against Iranian power plants, citing what he described as a request from the Iranian government. That request, multiple sources confirmed, had been transmitted through Pakistan. By April 7, the situation had reached a critical threshold. Trump had set a final deadline: reach a ceasefire or face the destruction of Iran's entire energy and civilian infrastructure. He had used the phrase, "the whole civilization will die tonight." The Islamabad communications room was active through the night. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 8, Pakistan announced a conditional 2-week ceasefire. Both sides accepted. U.S. stocks, which had been falling on conflict escalation fears, reversed direction within the hour. 3 days later, on April 11th, J.D. Vance arrived in Islamabad. He walked into the Islamabad Serena Hotel, accompanied by a 300-person U.S. negotiating team. Across the table sat senior Iranian officials, including Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. This was the first direct, senior-level diplomatic contact between the United States and Iran since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The last time this happened, the last time Washington and Tehran sat across a table at this level, was 47 years ago. It happened in Islamabad. What happened in April 2026 was not the first time Pakistan had inserted itself between two superpowers who were not speaking to each other. The last time Pakistan played this role was in 1971, and the consequences of that moment reshaped the entire Cold War. July 9, 1971. Henry Kissinger, the U.S. National Security Advisor, arrived in Islamabad on what was presented to the public as a routine tour of Asia. At a welcome dinner at the Prime Minister's residence, Kissinger appeared to fall ill. He retired early, citing stomach problems. He did not go to his room. A Pakistan International Airlines aircraft was waiting at a military airfield outside the city. Kissinger boarded it quietly with a small team. The plane flew him to Beijing. What happened over the next 2 days in Beijing? Kissinger's secret meetings with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai led directly to Nixon's historic 1972 visit to China, the normalization of U.S.-China relations, and one of the most consequential geopolitical realignments of the 20th century. The Cold War's balance of power shifted. The Sino-Soviet split deepened. A new triangular architecture emerged between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow that defined global politics for the next 2 decades. Pakistan arranged that flight. Winston Lord, who served as Kissinger's aide and was on the aircraft, described the decision decades later. "We finally settled on Pakistan. Pakistan had the advantage of being a friend to both sides." The parallels between 1971 and 2026 are so close that analysts across the world have been drawing them explicitly. The country with no formal diplomatic role. The personal trust of both adversaries. The physical infrastructure, then a PIA aircraft, now a hotel conference room in Islamabad. The moment when everyone else had failed, and one small country stepped forward because it was the only one positioned to do so. But there is a difference between 1971 and 2026 that most of the parallel drawing misses. In 1971, Pakistan was acting on behalf of American interests. Pakistan's then-President Yahya Khan was facilitating a shift that Nixon and Kissinger wanted and had designed. Pakistan was the mechanism of American foreign policy, not an independent actor. In 2026, Pakistan was not acting on behalf of American interests. It was acting on behalf of Pakistani interests. And that distinction changes everything about what this moment actually means. Let's be direct about something that most coverage of Pakistan's mediation has avoided. Pakistan did not broker this ceasefire out of a commitment to international peace and the sanctity of human life. Pakistan brokered this ceasefire because it needed to, and because it could extract something in return. The motivations are layered and worth examining clearly, because they tell you a great deal about how power actually operates in the modern world. The first motivation is economic survival. Pakistan's economy is still fragile. As of early 2026, oil prices, driven up by the Strait of Hormuz crisis, were running at approximately $113 per barrel, a level that was punishing Pakistan's import bill, burning through its thin foreign exchange reserves, and threatening to derail the IMF recovery program that was the only thing keeping the country financially solvent. Pakistan needed the strait reopened. Every day of continued conflict cost Pakistan money it did not have. The second motivation is the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. For years, a pipeline connecting Iran's massive South Pars gas field to Pakistan's energy-starved population had been stalled by U.S. sanctions. Pakistan desperately needs the energy. Iran is willing to sell. The only obstacle has been Washington. A U.S. Iran agreement that includes sanctions relief, one of the key issues on the Islamabad negotiating table, could revive that pipeline and give Pakistan access to reliable, affordable gas for the first time in a generation. The third motivation is geopolitical rehabilitation. Pakistan has spent the better part of a decade as a pariah in Western foreign policy circles. The killing of Osama bin Laden on Pakistani soil in 2011, accusations of supporting Taliban networks, Trump's 2018 lies and deceit tweet. The country had been reduced, in Western strategic thinking, to a source of problems rather than solutions. Mediation offered something enormously valuable: a narrative reset. Pakistan as problem creator versus Pakistan as peacemaker. The coverage speaks for itself. Chatham House, the Council on Foreign Relations; Al Jazeera, The Diplomat, Foreign Policy; Bloomberg. Every major analytical institution in the world published pieces in April 2026 examining Pakistan's emergence as an indispensable power. That kind of reputational rehabilitation is not something you can buy. You earn it by doing something no one else could do. The fourth motivation, and the most strategically significant, is leverage. Here is the calculation that Munir understood, and that almost no English-language analysis has stated plainly. Washington owes Islamabad a favor. Pakistan delivered something to the United States that the United States could not obtain for itself: direct contact with Iran's leadership at the highest level, in a setting that Iran trusted, with a ceasefire that prevented a military escalation that could have cost American lives, destabilized the Gulf for years, and sent oil to $200 per barrel. That favor is a form of currency. It can be spent. Debt relief, IMF support, access to American markets, relaxed pressure on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which Washington has long viewed with suspicion, protection from Indian diplomatic pressure in Washington. The list of things Pakistan might ask for in return is long, and Pakistan now has the standing to ask. One analyst at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute summarized it with unusual candor. The U.S. owes Pakistan. Washington now has a diplomatic debt to Islamabad. I want to be careful here, because the story of Pakistan's emergence is genuinely extraordinary. But it is not without serious complications. The Islamabad talks failed. That is the part that gets buried under the triumphalist coverage of Pakistan's diplomatic rise. Trump said it directly after the April 11th to 12th talks concluded. Most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not. Iran's foreign minister said a deal was just inches away, but accused the United States of maximalist demands. No second round of talks has been confirmed as of this recording. Since the ceasefire was declared, it has been violated by both sides. Iran attacked targets in the UAE on May 4. The United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian shipping on April 13, which Iran described as a violation of the ceasefire understanding itself. U.S. and Iranian forces traded fire in the Strait of Hormuz on May 7. The ceasefire is fragile. The talks are stalled, and Pakistan's mediation, for all its historical significance, has not yet produced the thing that actually matters: a durable agreement. This points to the first structural limit of Pakistan's position. Pakistan can get both sides in the room. It cannot make them agree. The nuclear question, whether Iran will accept permanent, verifiable limits on its enrichment program, is not a question that Pakistan's diplomacy can resolve. It requires a political decision by Iran about what kind of country it intends to be in a post-Khamenei world. That decision is being made in Tehran, not Islamabad. There is a second structural risk that analysts at the Stimson Center identified, and that deserves serious attention. Pakistan's mediation is built, in significant part, on one man, Field Marshal Asim Munir. The personal relationship between Munir and the Trump administration is central to why Washington trusted Pakistan with this role. Trump has a special liking for Pakistan's Chief of Defense Forces, as one Pakistani analyst noted, but Munir is not permanent, and Trump may not be either, or may shift his attention. Pakistan's mediation is dependent on a personal dynamic that is inherently fragile, a point reinforced by foreign policy's assessment that Pakistan's diplomatic rise is tied disproportionately to one man. There is a third complication that no one in Islamabad wants to discuss publicly, but that every strategic analyst in the region is thinking about. Pakistan has not been able to establish a direct channel with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, which, since Khamenei's assassination, has effectively become the most powerful decision-making body in Iran. Pakistani officials have dealt primarily with Iran's civilian government, President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Arakchi. But the IRGC is not the civilian government. It was the IRGC, analysts believe, that sanctioned Iranian missile strikes on Pakistani soil back in January 2024. It is the IRGC that will ultimately determine whether Iran agrees to any nuclear deal. If the IRGC decides it does not want an agreement, Pakistan cannot deliver one. And there is the India dimension, which is never far from any calculation Islamabad makes. Pakistan's new geopolitical standing is an explicit setback for India. New Delhi's strategic doctrine has long relied on the assumption that Pakistan would remain diplomatically isolated and economically weak, leaving India as the dominant regional power and the preferred American partner in South Asia. Pakistan's emergence as an indispensable mediator disrupts that assumption. Foreign policy noted bluntly that Pakistan's peacemaking is a setback for India. The two countries have been at heightened military tension throughout 2026, following attacks in Kashmir in April, and India has already applied pressure at the IMF to complicate Pakistan's access to funds. Pakistan is playing a very complex game on a board it does not fully control. Let me pull back now and give you the frame that I think explains why this story matters far beyond Pakistan, far beyond Iran, and far beyond the specific question of whether the Islamabad talks will eventually produce a deal. What Pakistan has done in 2026 is demonstrate something about the structure of international power that was known in theory but has now been proven in practice. The world is no longer organized around a simple hierarchy in which the United States makes decisions, its allies implement them, and everyone else reacts. In that old world, when a crisis emerged, the sequence was predictable. Washington mobilized its partners. The UN Security Council was convened. The G7 issued a statement. A Western-led mediation process was proposed. The crisis was either resolved on American terms or it wasn't resolved at all. That sequence broke down completely in the 2026 Iran crisis. Washington could not mediate. It was a belligerent. The UN was paralyzed by vetoes. Europe was diplomatically irrelevant, and the country that stepped into the vacuum was a nuclear-armed South Asian state with a $7 billion IMF bailout and a history of being accused of harboring terrorists. That is not the world of 2002, or 2012, or even 2022. That is a genuinely new world, in which the countries that matter in a given crisis are not necessarily the largest, wealthiest, or most militarily powerful. They are the countries that are trusted by both sides of a dispute, that have the geographic and institutional infrastructure to host direct contact, and that have enough strategic interest in resolution to commit serious political capital to making it happen. Pakistan fits that description in the U.S.-Iran crisis. Other countries will fit that description in future crises. Qatar is already doing this in other contexts. Turkey has done it. Indonesia is positioning for it. South Africa has done it in certain African disputes. Brazil has aspirations in this direction in Latin America. The age of middle power diplomacy is not a new concept. But 2026 may be the year when it became impossible to ignore. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to leave you with, because I think it is the part that most people will miss.